just a quiet veteran janitor at the Delta Force drone hangar, until the commander heard his name. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. In a Delta Force hangar, an unlikely hero's true identity is about to be revealed. It was a quiet morning at the Delta Force drone hangar, located deep within a highly secure military base. The hangar was vast, with rows of advanced drones lined up, waiting to be prepared for their next mission. The hum of machinery and the sharp smell of jet fuel filled the air. But amidst the high-tech equipment and the bustle of elite soldiers, there was one figure who seemed out of place. He was a janitor, but not just any janitor. This man, in his faded military-style jacket and worn boots, was cleaning the floors while others were preparing for missions that could shape the future of national security. His movements were slow, deliberate, and unassuming. His name was Arthur Hayes, a man in his late 60s, who had long been forgotten by most people around him. To the soldiers and officers in the hangar, he was nothing more than a background figure, someone who quietly swept the floors and cleaned the restrooms. He never spoke much, just nodded respectfully whenever a soldier passed by. He wore no special insignia, no medals on his chest, just a simple blue-collar shirt and khaki pants, the uniform of a janitor. But there was something about Arthur Hayes that didn't quite fit with the image of a humble maintenance worker. Most people never noticed it, but there were a few that did. The young soldiers, fresh out of boot camp, would often glance at him with curiosity. They whispered to each other, wondering why someone like him, an older man with so much history etched into his face, was cleaning the hangar. Some of them would smirk and joke, calling him just a janitor, unaware of the weight of those words. Arthur didn't mind. He had been through worse. He had seen things in his youth that had shaped him into the man he was today, quiet, reserved, and willing to put the past behind him. As he swept a corner of the hangar, his mind wandered back to those days. Days when he had been in the heat of battle, serving in a special forces unit, far away from the confines of this place. He had a history that could change everything if anyone cared to listen. But no one did. No one ever asked. He looked up as a few soldiers passed by, their eyes barely acknowledging him. One of them, a younger officer, nudged his friend and smirked. "What's this old guy doing here? Shouldn't he be retired?" he laughed. The other soldier snorted, clearly uninterested in the answer. They passed by, continuing their conversation, oblivious to the man who had once been part of the most elite units in the military. As Arthur continued his task, he heard the sound of boots marching towards him. He looked up, expecting to see another officer passing by, but this time, it was someone different. The commander's presence filled the room with a sense of purpose. Colonel Michael Bradford, the commanding officer of the Delta Force unit, strode towards him with a stern expression. The young officer who had been mocking Arthur stopped in his tracks, his face turning pale as he realized who was walking toward them. Colonel Bradford had heard something that made him stop in his tracks. He had heard the name of the janitor. And that name, though forgotten by most, carried a weight that could shake the foundations of anyone who knew the truth. Arthur Hayes was no ordinary janitor. Colonel Bradford's eyes narrowed as he recognized the man who had quietly cleaned the hangar for years. He had seen that name in military records, buried deep in the archives. A name that had belonged to a legend, someone whose feats had once been the stuff of military folklore. Arthur Hayes was not just a janitor. He was a war hero, a man whose accomplishments on the battlefield had saved countless lives. The officer who had mocked him stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment as he saw the expression on Colonel Bradford's face. Colonel Bradford walked up to Arthur and, without a word, extended his hand. Arthur looked up, surprised but not shocked. He had seen many commanders in his day, and some of them had earned his respect. This one, though, was different. "Arthur Hayes," the colonel said, his voice firm. "It's an honor to finally meet you." The room fell silent as everyone looked on in disbelief. The janitor they had all ignored for years was suddenly a man of immense importance, and no one had even known it. The young officer who had mocked him earlier was now standing still, unable to speak, his mouth agape. Colonel Bradford's gaze shifted to the others in the room. "This man," he began, "is one of the most decorated veterans of our time. He was part of the Special Forces unit that conducted one of the most successful and dangerous missions in history. He's the man who saved the lives of over 100 soldiers during the Battle of Black Ridge. And you all treated him like this." His voice dropped, filled with a quiet fury. The silence in the hangar was deafening. No one knew how to respond. The soldiers, once so confident and dismissive, now stood frozen, their eyes wide as they realized the truth. Arthur Hayes wasn't just a janitor. He was a living legend. The hangar was still, an eerie silence hanging in the air after the colonel's words had reverberated through the room. Arthur Hayes, the quiet janitor who had been dismissed and ignored for years, stood there as the reality of his past settled into the minds of the men around him. Colonel Bradford's words still echoed in the space, and the soldiers, once brimming with arrogance, now seemed like children caught in a lie. The young officer who had mocked Arthur earlier was rooted to the spot, his face flushed with embarrassment, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Arthur didn't speak, his gaze steady, looking neither proud nor upset, just accepting. He had seen these reactions before, and they didn't faze him. It wasn't the first time his true identity had been exposed, and it likely wouldn't be the last. What bothered him most was the irony of it all. Here, in the very hangar that housed the most advanced military technology, where the soldiers prided themselves on being the best of the best, a man who had once been among their elite was now reduced to sweeping floors. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Colonel Bradford's sharp eyes shifted to the officers who were still processing the shock. "Arthur," he began again, his voice less formal now, more like a man who had just uncovered a hidden treasure. "I don't think you've been given the recognition you deserve. Not by any of us. But that's about to change." The colonel turned to face the young officer, who still stood frozen, his face pale. "You'll be addressing this man properly from now on." "Understood." The officer nodded, his throat dry, his pride shattered in an instant. "Yes, sir," he muttered. Colonel Bradford then turned his attention back to Arthur. "I don't think you've had a proper welcome since you've been here. We owe you more than just recognition, Arthur. We owe you the respect that comes with your service." Arthur simply nodded again, his expression unreadable. He had been on the receiving end of both mockery and reverence over the years, and he knew that this new recognition would soon fade as well. But for now, he appreciated the gesture. He had not come here for applause. He had come to be left alone. He didn't need medals or accolades. What mattered was the work that had already been done, the lives saved, the battles fought and won. He had done his part. And yet, something stirred inside him, a reminder that sometimes the past wasn't done with you, no matter how much you tried to move on. The sound of footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Arthur didn't have to look up to know who it was. The air shifted, becoming tense with the arrival of another officer. General Mitchell, a towering figure in military circles, entered the hangar with a purposeful stride. His face, normally a mask of stone, was set with a seriousness that immediately demanded respect. He stopped when he saw Arthur standing there, still in his janitor's uniform, but his presence was commanding enough to make the entire hangar fall still. General Mitchell looked directly at Arthur, his eyes narrowing with recognition. "Arthur Hayes," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood the importance of this moment. Arthur turned, his expression unchanged. "General," he greeted with a simple nod. There was no grand speech, no dramatic announcement, but the respect in the air was palpable. General Mitchell's hand reached up to his collar and slowly, deliberately, removed his rank insignia. "This is for you," he said, offering it to Arthur. "I've been serving in the military for over 30 years, and I've never met a man whose actions speak louder than their title. But you are the kind of man we should all aspire to be." Arthur hesitated for a moment before accepting the insignia. He didn't need it to remind him of who he was, but it felt right to accept it, in this moment, from a man who truly understood. The soldiers around them stood at attention, their eyes wide, some of them still in shock, others feeling the weight of the situation. The colonel, watching from the sidelines, gave a subtle nod of approval. The moment was profound, but it wasn't about the insignia or the recognition. It was about the acknowledgement of a man who had quietly served his country, fought in wars that most of these soldiers had only read about, and then quietly faded into the background. Arthur's life had been a testament to humility and duty, and in that moment, it was all being acknowledged. The hangar was silent except for the soft sound of Arthur's footsteps as he turned and walked towards the corner of the room, where his cleaning supplies were still neatly arranged. He didn't need the attention, but he knew the respect was finally his. The soldiers, now realizing the weight of the moment, stood there for a long while, processing the true meaning of what had just unfolded. And as for Arthur, he went back to his work, as quietly as he had always done, knowing that the respect he had earned would stay with him, even if the world around him continued to move forward. The recognition wasn't necessary. He had already given everything he had, and in the end, that was enough. As the day wore on, the tension in the Delta Force hangar was palpable. The soldiers who had once disregarded Arthur Hayes, the quiet janitor, were now shifting uncomfortably in their positions, processing the shift in dynamics. Colonel Bradford had made it clear to everyone. Arthur was no ordinary man. But the full gravity of the situation had yet to sink in. Arthur went back to his duties, sweeping the floor as if nothing had changed. He didn't seek attention, didn't look for praise. He had made peace with his past long ago. But the men around him, those who had once mocked him, were now reflecting on the true measure of the man they had so carelessly dismissed. The buzz of conversations faded as they tried to process the reality of what had just happened. To most, Arthur Hayes was still just a janitor, the man with the broom. But to a select few, he was a living legend, someone whose name was whispered in the halls of military history. It wasn't long before another officer arrived in the hangar. Captain Rachel Monroe, a sharp-eyed strategist with a reputation for getting things done, walked in with a purpose. She was a woman who had seen combat firsthand, and her eyes immediately locked onto Arthur as she entered the room. She had heard the rumors, had heard whispers from other soldiers about Arthur's history, but seeing him in person, quiet, focused on his work, was something entirely different. As she approached, she saw Colonel Bradford standing off to the side, his posture relaxed but alert. His expression remained serious, knowing that Captain Monroe would understand what had just transpired. "Colonel." Captain Monroe greeted him with a nod, her eyes never leaving Arthur. "I've been hearing about this man for years, but I never imagined I'd find him here, of all places." The colonel glanced over at Arthur and then back to Monroe. "Arthur Hayes isn't just anyone. He's part of a history that goes deeper than any of us. You've heard the stories, Rachel. Now you're seeing the man behind them." Captain Monroe's gaze softened as she turned to look at Arthur. "So, he's really the one? The guy who saved a whole unit during the Battle of Black Ridge?" Colonel Bradford nodded gravely. "That's him. The man who carried the wounded on his back, who led his team through enemy lines with nothing but sheer grit and determination. But it's more than that. Arthur Hayes is the kind of soldier whose name was never meant to be on any plaque or memorial. He never wanted that. He's the definition of humility." Monroe studied Arthur for a long moment, her mind racing with the knowledge of the countless lives he had saved. "And he's been here, in this hangar, working quietly all this time?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. Colonel Bradford sighed. "Yes, he never sought recognition. He just wanted to live out the rest of his days in peace. But the truth always has a way of coming to light." Monroe turned her attention back to Arthur. "How does he feel about all this attention? Does he want it?" Colonel Bradford smiled faintly. "Arthur doesn't need attention. He's already done more than most people could even imagine. But there's one thing you should know, Rachel. Arthur Hayes doesn't forget. And he doesn't back down from a challenge. He never has." Just as Colonel Bradford finished his sentence, the door to the hangar opened again. This time, it wasn't another officer walking in. It was a group of soldiers, the ones who had once mocked Arthur, the ones who had never given him a second thought. They stopped short when they saw Captain Monroe and Colonel Bradford standing near Arthur. The leader of the group, a young sergeant, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Colonel, Captain, we wanted to apologize," he began, his voice filled with hesitation. "We didn't know. We didn't understand." The other soldiers stood quietly behind him, their heads lowered. The recognition was there. Arthur Hayes wasn't just the janitor. He was the man they had all underestimated, and now they saw him for who he truly was. Arthur didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge their apology. He simply continued with his work, his broom sweeping across the floor in smooth, steady motions. The sergeant stood in silence for a moment before stepping forward. Sir, he said to Arthur, his voice quieter now, we were wrong. I didn't know who you were. What you did. The words were heavy, and for the first time, the soldiers understood the weight of the silence they had imposed on Arthur for so long. But Arthur didn't respond. He didn't need to. His past spoke for him. Captain Monroe turned to the group of soldiers, her eyes hard. You have a lot to learn about respect, and it starts with understanding the people around you. The man you've all ignored for so long, he's the one who should be leading you, not the other way around. The room fell silent, and Arthur finally stopped sweeping. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking with the young sergeants for the first time. It's not about who leads or who follows, Arthur said quietly, his voice calm but firm. It's about doing what needs to be done, no matter who's watching. You learn that, and you'll understand what it really means to serve. The soldiers stood frozen, taking in his words. They had come here to apologize, to make amends for their past behavior. But what they didn't realize was that the man they had disrespected had already forgiven them. His actions, his past, spoke louder than any apology ever could. As Arthur resumed his work, the soldiers dispersed, their heads held a little higher, their minds a little clearer. Captain Monroe and Colonel Bradford watched in silence, knowing that this moment would be one the soldiers would never forget. The true measure of a man isn't always in the medals or the accolades. Sometimes, it's in the quiet moments, the ones where his character shines through, even when no one is looking. The days that followed the revelation of Arthur Hayes' true identity were filled with a strange, uneasy tension. The hangar, once filled with the sounds of soldiers preparing drones and equipment for missions, now seemed quieter, the weight of the unspoken respect in the air palpable. The men who had once walked past Arthur without a second glance now looked at him with a mix of awe and humility. They no longer saw just a janitor, but a living legend who had quietly walked among them, his history buried beneath the layers of time and silence. Arthur, however, continued with his work as though nothing had changed. He moved through the hangar as if he were invisible, focusing on his task, keeping his head down. The attention, the recognition, it didn't matter to him. He had long since made peace with the fact that his true identity would remain unknown to most. As long as he could serve in his own way, that was enough. But despite his stoic exterior, the ripple effects of his past were undeniable. Word of his true identity spread quickly through the base. Soldiers, officers, and even civilians began to approach him with a new sense of respect. Some asked about his past, but most simply nodded in acknowledgement as they passed by, knowing that the man they once overlooked had a history that commanded reverence. It was a strange shift, one that Arthur wasn't sure how to handle. He had spent so many years in the shadows, living a quiet life, that the sudden recognition felt both overwhelming and humbling. One morning, as he was walking through the hangar to start his usual routine, he was stopped by Captain Rachel Monroe. She had been watching him for days, observing how he carried himself with such quiet dignity. Arthur, she said, her tone soft but serious, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. Something that's been bothering me. Arthur turned to face her, his expression neutral. What's on your mind, Captain? You never talk about your past, Monroe said, her voice filled with curiosity. And you've never asked for anything, even after we all found out who you really are. What? Arthur paused, looking at the young captain for a long moment. His eyes, tired and weathered by years of experience, softened as he spoke. There's nothing to say, he replied, his voice quiet but steady. I did what needed to be done. The past is the past. I don't need accolades or recognition. I just need to keep moving forward. Monroe nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his words. But don't you think you deserve more? You saved so many lives, and yet you've lived in the shadows, doing menial work. That's not right, Arthur. Arthur shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Life isn't about being in the spotlight, Captain. Sometimes, the real work happens quietly, in the background. That's where I've always belonged. Monroe stood in silence for a moment, watching him as if seeing him for the first time. You're right, she said finally, her voice tinged with respect. You've earned more than anyone I know, and yet you've never asked for anything in return. You're a true hero, Arthur. Arthur simply nodded, grateful for her understanding. He didn't need to hear it from anyone else. He knew what he had done, and that was enough for him. As the days passed, the respect for Arthur only grew. The men who had once mocked him now greeted him with genuine respect, often offering a quiet nod or a word of thanks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that they had learned something important, something that Arthur had always known. True honor wasn't about recognition. It was about what you did when no one was watching. One afternoon, as the hangar was quieting down after a busy day of preparations, Arthur found himself alone, sitting on a bench in the corner of the room. The sun was setting outside, casting a warm golden light across the floor. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. Just as he was about to stand and continue his work, he heard footsteps approaching. He opened his eyes to see Colonel Bradford walking toward him, a serious expression on his face. "Arthur," the colonel said, stopping in front of him. "I've been thinking about something." Arthur stood up, surprised. "What is it, sir?" "We're sending a team out on a special mission," Colonel Bradford said, his voice low. "And I think you're the one who needs to lead it." Arthur blinked, unsure if he had heard him correctly. "Lead it?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're serious?" "Absolutely," Colonel Bradford said firmly. "We need someone who knows how to handle a tough situation. Someone who's been through the worst and can lead a team to victory. You're the man for the job, Arthur." Arthur looked at the colonel for a long moment, his mind racing. He had spent years in the shadows, doing his part without anyone knowing. And now, here he was, being offered a chance to step back into the light. "I don't know, Colonel," Arthur said, his voice uncertain. "I've been away from the field for a long time." The colonel smiled. "That's exactly why we need you. You've got the experience. You've got the heart. And most importantly, you've got the respect of everyone here. They'll follow you, Arthur. They trust you." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. The weight of the decision hung in the air. For the first time in years, he felt a fire stirring inside him. A fire he thought he had left behind long ago. "I'll do it," Arthur said finally, his voice steady. "I'll lead the mission." The colonel's eyes lit up with approval. "Good. We leave tomorrow." As Arthur prepared for the mission, he knew that this would be his last chance to truly lead, to show the men who had once underestimated him that he still had what it took. This time, there would be no hiding in the shadows. This time, the world would see who Arthur Hayes truly was. As the sun set over the military base, casting long shadows over the hangar, Arthur Hayes found himself standing at the edge of the tarmac, ready to embark on a mission that could change the course of his life once more. The colonel had made it clear that this mission would be a true test of everything Arthur had learned in his years of service. But for Arthur, it was just another day, another opportunity to do what he had always done. Get the job done, no matter the cost. The team assembled around him, all of them young soldiers, eager but uncertain. They had no idea what to expect from their leader, a man they had once overlooked. Arthur stood before them, his gaze steady, his posture calm. He had never been one for speeches, but he knew the gravity of the moment. These men needed to see him as a leader, not just a relic of the past. "Listen up," Arthur said, his voice low but carrying. "This mission isn't about glory. It's about getting in and getting out, saving lives, and completing the objective. We've trained for this, and I know we're ready." The soldiers exchanged glances, their uncertainty palpable. They had heard the rumors about Arthur, but none of them had ever seen him in action. None of them knew the man who had been part of the most dangerous operations in military history. But that was about to change. As the team moved out, the tension in the air was thick. The convoy of vehicles rumbled down the road, kicking up dust as they made their way to the designated drop point. Arthur rode in the lead vehicle, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind focused on the task at hand. He could feel the weight of the men behind him, the responsibility of their safety pressing on his shoulders. They were about to enter hostile territory, a place where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. As they neared the drop point, the vehicle slowed, and Arthur signaled for the team to disembark. The soldiers quickly gathered their gear, checking weapons and communications, their nerves taut with anticipation. They were no longer just following orders. They were following the man who had lived through it all, the man who had seen the horrors of war and survived. Arthur led them into the heart of enemy territory, moving with the precision of someone who had been there before. He knew the terrain like the back of his hand, having fought in some of the most dangerous locations around the world. The team followed closely, their movements synchronized, their trust in Arthur growing with each step. It wasn't long before they encountered the first obstacle, a fortified position manned by enemy soldiers. The young soldiers froze for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. But Arthur was already moving, already thinking. He signaled for two of the soldiers to flank the position while the rest of the team provided cover. His plan was simple, effective, and fast, just the way he had always worked. The soldiers followed his lead, their actions sharp and efficient. Within minutes, the enemy position was neutralized, and the team moved on without a single shot fired in retaliation. The soldiers were beginning to understand what made Arthur different from the men they had once known him to be. He wasn't just a janitor, a forgotten soldier. He was a man who had seen the worst of war and had come out the other side with a wisdom that no amount of training could replicate. As the team pressed forward, the mission continued to unfold seamlessly. With each challenge they faced, Arthur's leadership became more evident. He was calm under pressure, making split-second decisions with confidence and clarity. The soldiers who had once been skeptical of his abilities were now following his every move, trusting in his experience and expertise. The young sergeant, the same man who had once mocked Arthur, now found himself looking to him for guidance. Arthur's presence on the field was undeniable, a quiet authority that commanded respect without a single word of boast. Finally, after hours of maneuvering through enemy lines, the team reached their objective, a communications facility that held critical intelligence. Arthur didn't hesitate. He gave the order to move in, and the soldiers followed without question. The mission was a success, but it was more than just the capture of valuable information. It was the transformation of the soldiers around him. They had seen Arthur Hayes for who he truly was, not just a hero from the past, but a leader in the present. As they made their way back to base, the weight of the mission lifted, and the soldiers, once unsure of their leader, now walked with a newfound respect for the man who had led them to victory. When they returned to the base, Colonel Bradford was waiting for them. He stood at the entrance of the hangar, his expression serious but pleased. "Well done, Arthur," he said, nodding toward him. "You proved exactly what I knew you were capable of." Arthur gave a small nod, his face betraying little emotion. "It was a team effort, sir. We all did our part." Colonel Bradford smiled. "You always do." As the team unloaded their gear and prepared to head back to their quarters, Arthur lingered for a moment, watching the soldiers. They had changed. The respect that had once been forced upon them was now earned. Arthur Hayes was no longer just the janitor. He was the man who had led them into the field and come out victorious. For Arthur, it was enough. He didn't need to hear the accolades. He didn't need the spotlight. All he needed was to know that, in the end, the work had been done and the mission had been a success. And for the first time in years, Arthur Hayes felt a sense of peace. He had done his part. The rest was up to the young men who would carry the torch forward. The days following the mission were quieter, yet filled with a new sense of purpose. Arthur Hayes, the man who had once been invisible to the young soldiers around him, now walked through the Delta Force hangar with a new kind of recognition in the eyes of those who once mocked him. The respect was unspoken but undeniable. Arthur never asked for it, but he had earned it through years of selfless service, both on the battlefield and in the quiet moments that defined him. As he continued his work, his focus never wavered. But there was something different now, a subtle change in how others interacted with him. They no longer saw just the janitor. They saw a man of experience, a man whose quiet strength had carried them through the mission. The younger soldiers began to seek him out, asking for advice, learning from him in ways they hadn't before. One morning, as the sun rose over the base, Arthur was approached by Sergeant Nathaniel Carter, a young man who had once been skeptical of him. Nathaniel had grown to respect Arthur's leadership during the mission, and now he found himself seeking him out. Unsure of how to start the conversation. "Hey, Arthur," Nathaniel called, his voice tentative as he approached the older man who was already sweeping the floor. "Got a minute?" Arthur looked up from his work, his expression calm as always. "Of course, Sergeant. What's on your mind?" Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably, not used to addressing someone he had once viewed as a figure to be dismissed. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did on the mission," he said. "The way you led us, how you kept your cool under pressure. I've never seen anyone do it quite like you." Arthur paused for a moment, his broom still in his hands. He gave a small nod, acknowledging Nathaniel's words without fanfare. I've been around for a long time, Sergeant, Arthur replied quietly. I've learned that sometimes it's not about having the best equipment or the flashiest moves. It's about keeping a level head and trusting your team. Nathaniel looked down at his boots, his hands clasped behind his back. I just wanted to say thanks, he said, his voice a little more genuine this time. You really taught me something out there. Arthur gave him a brief, nodding smile. I didn't teach you anything you didn't already know, he said. You just had to learn to trust yourself. Nathaniel stood there for a moment, still processing the gravity of what he had just heard. Arthur had a way of making the simplest words carry more weight than 1,000 lessons. You're not just a janitor, are you? Nathaniel asked, his voice quieter now. Arthur's gaze softened, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth had already been laid bare, and Nathaniel could see it for himself now. As the day went on, more and more of the soldiers, those who had once treated Arthur as little more than background noise, began to seek him out for guidance. Some asked for advice on strategy, some on life, and others simply wanted to thank him for leading them in ways they had never thought possible. Arthur remained humble throughout it all, never seeking the spotlight, never drawing attention to himself. He had spent most of his life in the shadows, doing what needed to be done without complaint, and that was how he preferred it. The respect, while appreciated, didn't change who he was or why he had joined in the first place. It was a quiet day when Colonel Bradford approached him again, this time with a more solemn expression. Arthur, the colonel began, his tone more serious than usual. I need to talk to you about something. Arthur looked up from his work, his brow furrowed in curiosity. What is it, sir? Colonel Bradford hesitated for a moment before continuing. We've got another mission coming up. A high-stakes one, and I need someone I can count on. Someone who's been through the worst and come out the other side. We need you, Arthur. I need you to lead this one, too. Arthur didn't respond immediately. The weight of the colonel's words hung in the air. He had led men before, in the toughest of conditions. But leading again meant stepping into the light once more, something he had avoided for years. He glanced at the colonel, his expression unreadable. I thought you wanted to move on from all that, Arthur said, his voice quiet. The colonel met his gaze, his eyes filled with understanding. We need you now, Arthur. The soldiers look up to you. They trust you. And the mission, well, it's important. I need you to lead them again. Arthur stood still for a moment, processing the request. It wasn't that he was afraid of leading again. It was simply that he had become so comfortable in the shadows. But the colonel was right. He had something to offer, something no one else could. All right, Arthur said after a long pause, his voice steady. I'll lead the mission. The colonel's face broke into a rare smile. Thank you, Arthur. I knew I could count on you. As the days passed and preparations for the mission began, Arthur found himself slipping into the familiar rhythm of leadership. The young soldiers who had once questioned his abilities now looked to him for guidance, for reassurance. And Arthur gave it to them, not with grand speeches or elaborate plans, but with quiet confidence and the kind of experience that could only come from having lived through the very situations they now faced. The mission, when it came, was everything they had trained for and more. It tested their resolve, their courage, and their ability to work as a team. But through it all, Arthur remained calm, his leadership unwavering. The mission was a success, and when they returned to base, there was no grand celebration, no victory parade. Just a group of soldiers who had followed their leader through the fire and come out the other side. And Arthur Hayes, once just a janitor, stood among them, not for the accolades, but because he knew what it meant to truly lead. The respect was there, quietly earned, just as it had always been. And for Arthur, that was enough. After the success of their most recent mission, things were quieter around the Delta Force hangar. The soldiers who had once overlooked Arthur Hayes, the janitor-turned-leader, had begun to treat him with the respect he deserved, though Arthur remained just as humble as he always had been. For him, it wasn't about the recognition. It was about completing the mission, protecting the team, and moving forward. Yet, despite his quiet nature, there was no denying that a shift had occurred. The younger soldiers began approaching him more frequently, seeking his wisdom, advice, and even his opinion on their strategies. Arthur, of course, was happy to help. But there was something else stirring within him, a sense of restlessness that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had been living in the shadows for years, content to stay out of the limelight. But now, after leading a team on a successful mission, The old fire he thought was long gone seemed to have reignited. And yet, something held him back. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the base, Arthur sat alone in the break room, a cup of coffee in hand. He had just finished another day of cleaning the hangar and giving advice to the soldiers, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to reflect on everything that had happened. He had been a part of some of the most dangerous and high-stakes operations the military had ever seen. Yet here he was, just another janitor, cleaning floors and watching the younger soldiers prepare for the next mission. Was this what he was meant for? Was this all he had left? The door to the break room opened, and Colonel Bradford stepped inside. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down across from Arthur, his eyes thoughtful. Arthur looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What's on your mind, sir?" he asked. "I've been watching you," the colonel replied after a long pause. "The way the soldiers respond to you, the respect they show. It's clear to me that you're not just a leader in the field. You're a leader here, too." Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the cup down on the table. "I've always done my job," he said simply. "That's all." Colonel Bradford nodded. "But it's more than that, Arthur. You've been leading without even realizing it. The soldiers look to you. They trust you. And I think it's time you step up again." Arthur's gaze hardened slightly. "Step up? I've already done my part. I've led my team. Now, I'm just trying to make sure they're ready for what comes next. That's all I need to do." "That's not enough," the colonel said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I need you, Arthur. The base needs you. I can't keep doing this alone, and the soldiers can't either. You're the one who can show them how to truly lead. They've seen you in action, but I think they still need to see the man you were." Arthur leaned back in his chair, the weight of the colonel's words sinking in. He had led his team on the last mission, yes, but there was still a part of him that was reluctant to fully embrace the mantle of leadership. It wasn't that he didn't believe in himself. He had seen the worst of humanity and survived. It was that he had grown so used to being the quiet, humble figure in the background that stepping into the spotlight felt unnatural. Colonel Bradford could see the hesitation in Arthur's eyes. "I know you're not used to this, but it's time. We can't do it without you." Arthur stared at the table for a moment, then sighed. "I don't know, sir. I've been away from the field for so long. It's hard to just jump back in." The colonel placed a hand on the table, leaning forward. "That's exactly why we need you. You're not like the others. You've been through it all. You know what it means to lead under pressure. You've already proven yourself." Arthur looked at him, his eyes searching. He didn't want to admit it, but there was a part of him that missed the feeling, the sense of purpose that came with being in the thick of things, leading his men to victory. "I can't go back to being just a janitor," Arthur said quietly, almost to himself. The colonel gave him a knowing look. "You're not just a janitor, Arthur. You never were. The soldiers see that now. I see that now. You've earned the right to be more than that. And if you're ready, I'll make sure everyone else sees it too." The room was silent for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the base's cooling system. Arthur looked up at the colonel, the weight of his words settling in. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was time. Time to step up. Time to lead again. He stood, his chair scraping across the floor as he pushed it back. "All right, Colonel," Arthur said, his voice steady. "I'll do it. I'll lead them again." The colonel's face lit up with approval. "Thank you, Arthur. I knew I could count on you." As Arthur walked out of the break room, a sense of resolve washed over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one he was ready to walk. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was a leader, and it was time for the world to see it. He wasn't done yet. The day Arthur Hayes took his place as the leader of the new mission was one filled with an unusual kind of intensity. The soldiers who had once seen him as nothing more than a janitor were now looking at him with new eyes. There was no mistaking the respect in their gazes. They saw the man who had led them through their last successful mission, the one who had steered them through challenges with unshakable calm and wisdom. But now, as they prepared for another high-stakes operation, they were ready to follow him once again. The mission briefing room was crowded with soldiers, their faces a mixture of determination and anticipation. The last mission had been tough, but this one would be different. There were higher stakes, more enemies, and less room for error. Arthur stood in front of the map, his finger tracing the route the team would take. His voice was calm, steady, each word deliberate. "This isn't just another operation," Arthur said, his gaze sweeping across the room. We're not here to make a statement. We're here to get the job done, to complete the mission, and to keep each other alive. The soldiers nodded, their focus sharpening with every word he spoke. The way he carried himself, so composed, so confident, made it clear that they were in good hands. Arthur didn't need to raise his voice. His mere presence was enough to command the room. He continued, outlining the strategy, detailing the mission steps with precision. His instructions were simple yet effective. As the meeting concluded, the soldiers filed out, leaving Arthur and Colonel Bradford alone in the room. The colonel gave Arthur a long look, his eyes filled with both admiration and understanding. "You're doing the right thing, Arthur," the colonel said. "The team needs you. They trust you." Arthur gave a small nod, though his mind was already focused on the task ahead. "They've always had the potential," Arthur said quietly. "I'm just the one guiding them to realize it." That was the thing about leadership, Arthur thought. It wasn't about being the loudest or the most charismatic. It was about knowing when to step forward and when to step back, knowing how to inspire trust without demanding it. The team needed him, but not for the reasons they thought. They didn't need a hero. They needed a leader who could teach them how to be heroes themselves. As they moved out in the convoy, the atmosphere was different from last time. The tension was still there, but there was also an unspoken bond, a camaraderie that had been forged in the heat of battle. The soldiers now trusted each other in a way they hadn't before, and it wasn't just because of Arthur. It was because they had all learned something from him, something intangible, something that couldn't be taught in a training manual. The convoy rumbled down the dusty roads, heading deeper into enemy territory. The mission was critical. One wrong move could mean disaster. But Arthur had never felt more prepared. He had faced worse. He had seen men break. He had seen the limits of human endurance tested in ways that most could never imagine. But through it all, he had learned to remain calm, to push through when everything seemed lost. The team followed his lead, staying close, maintaining their composure, and relying on each other. The closer they got to the target, the more the tension in the air thickened. This was it, the point of no return. As they reached the perimeter of the enemy compound, Arthur signaled for the team to halt. The soldiers spread out, taking positions around the area, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Arthur's mind was sharp, focused on the task. The plan had been set, but plans were only as good as the people executing them. And this team, these young soldiers who had once looked at him as nothing more than a quiet janitor, were now his equals. He trusted them, and they trusted him. As the team moved in, everything seemed to slow down. The world around them became a blur of motion and sounds, the rhythmic crunch of boots against the dirt, the soft hiss of radios, the distant hum of enemy vehicles. Then, just as they neared the compound's entry point, an alarm sounded. The enemy had detected their presence. In an instant, the situation went from tactical to chaotic. Bullets began to fly. The soldiers responded without hesitation, their training kicking in. Arthur remained calm, his eyes scanning the area, his mind working faster than ever. "Cover the entrance," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Move forward." The soldiers followed his orders without question, moving with the precision and confidence they had learned from him. The firefight was intense, but the team held their ground, working in unison to neutralize the enemy forces. Arthur moved with them, his experience guiding every decision. It wasn't just his knowledge of tactics that made him a great leader. It was his ability to remain calm under pressure, his ability to make split-second decisions that saved lives. When the dust finally settled, the mission was a success. The target had been secured, and the enemy forces had been neutralized. The soldiers stood in silence for a moment, catching their breath, their adrenaline still high. They had done it. Arthur walked among them, his gaze steady, his expression calm. He didn't need to say anything. The respect in their eyes said it all. As they made their way back to base, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. They had followed Arthur into the heart of enemy territory and emerged victorious. And as they drove back, they knew that, despite all the accolades, despite all the recognition, Arthur Hayes was the man who had made it possible. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was their leader, the one who had taught them what it truly meant to serve and to lead. And as for Arthur, he knew that this mission, like all the others, was just one more step in the journey. A journey that would never truly end. The days following their successful mission were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The soldiers who had once underestimated Arthur Hayes now looked at him with a deep respect, but Arthur remained just as he always had been, humble and focused. As he continued his work in the hangar, cleaning and maintaining equipment, his thoughts often wandered back to the mission, the soldiers, and the path that had led him here. The weight of the recognition he had earned seemed lighter each day, and yet the respect from his fellow soldiers was unmistakable. They no longer saw him as just the janitor. They saw the man who had once been a leader, the man who had quietly fought wars that no one would ever fully understand. As the base settled into a familiar rhythm, Colonel Bradford called Arthur into his office one morning. The colonel's expression was serious, but there was a glint of something else in his eyes, something that Arthur had come to recognize as the first step toward another challenge. "Arthur," the colonel began, motioning for him to sit. "We've got another operation in the works. It's going to be one of the most critical we've ever undertaken. And I need someone with experience, someone who can stay calm under pressure. I need you, Arthur." Arthur didn't flinch at the request, though the weight of it hung in the air. He had led men into battle before, but this felt different. He looked at the colonel, his face unreadable. "What kind of mission are we talking about, sir?" The colonel leaned forward, his voice low. "A high-value target in a hostile zone. We've got intel that suggests they've been hiding out in a place no one would expect, deep within the mountains." Arthur's mind immediately went to the tactics, the terrain, and the strategies they would need to use to infiltrate such a place. He had trained for situations like this, but the reality of it always brought with it a sense of weight. Each decision, each move would carry consequences. "I'm ready, Colonel," Arthur replied. After a pause, his voice steady and sure. "But this isn't going to be easy." The colonel nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I know, but I've seen you in action, and I trust you more than anyone else." As the team prepared for the mission, Arthur felt a familiar sense of purpose rising within him. The days of sweeping floors and leading quietly from the sidelines seemed distant now. He was about to return to the field, where his skills had been honed and where he had always felt most at home. The soldiers who had once followed his every word now looked to him with even more respect, their trust in him unwavering. They had seen what he was capable of, and now they knew that they were in the hands of someone who had truly earned his place among them. As the convoy set out toward the mountains, Arthur sat in the lead vehicle, his thoughts focused on the mission ahead. The road was long, the terrain rugged, but there was no hesitation in his mind. He had led his team through dangerous situations before, and this would be no different. The mountains loomed ahead, a challenge they had prepared for, but the dangers that lay hidden in the shadows were something even the most experienced soldiers couldn't anticipate. The closer they got to the target zone, the more the tension in the air seemed to build. The soldiers knew that this mission wasn't just about taking down a high-value target. It was about proving to themselves and to the world that they could handle anything, no matter how impossible it seemed. They had been trained to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared them for the terrain that lay ahead. As the convoy neared the base of the mountain, they halted to regroup. Arthur stepped out of the vehicle, his boots hitting the ground with a steady thud. The air was thin, the mountains towering above them, casting long shadows as the sun began to set. He surveyed the landscape, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence. "We move fast, we stay low, and we don't give them any chance to prepare. Let's do this." The team nodded, their faces set with determination. They had trained for this moment. Now, it was time to put everything they had learned into action. As they made their way up the steep incline, the sounds of nature surrounded them, birds, rustling leaves, the wind. But beneath it all, there was a sense of urgency, a quiet tension that only they could feel. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also unforgiving. Every step had to be calculated, every movement deliberate. It wasn't long before they reached the entrance to a cave system, the place where their target was believed to be hiding. The darkness inside was suffocating, the air thick with dust and the smell of old earth. Arthur signaled for the team to stop and take cover. "We move in pairs," he instructed, his voice low but firm. "Watch each other's backs and stay sharp." The soldiers moved in synchronized pairs, their movements fluid and quiet. As they navigated the labyrinth of tunnels, every turn, every shadow held the potential for danger. The farther they went, the more the sense of danger intensified. Suddenly, there was a noise, footsteps echoing down the narrow passage. Arthur's heart raced as he signaled for the team to stop. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and then, through the darkness, a figure appeared. Arthur's hand instinctively went to his weapon, but as the figure stepped into the dim light, his tension eased. It wasn't an enemy soldier, it was their target. The mission was a success, but it had come with its own set of challenges. Arthur Hayes had once again led his team through adversity, proving that no matter where the road took him, he was always ready to face whatever came next. The aftermath of the mission left the team feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had done it. They had infiltrated the mountain base, neutralized the target, and successfully completed a mission that many had thought would be impossible. The ride back to base was quieter than usual. The convoy moved slowly through the rugged terrain, the soldiers reflecting on the operation they had just completed. Arthur Hayes, sitting in the lead vehicle, looked out the window, his mind already shifting to the next task, the next challenge. The mission was behind them, but the journey was far from over. He had always been the kind of man who focused on the work, never dwelling too long on victories or failures. Yet, this time, something felt different. The team had followed his lead without question. They had trusted him when the stakes were high, when the pressure was overwhelming. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur realized something important. He wasn't just leading them in battle. He was guiding them through life. His role had shifted. No longer was he just the quiet janitor or the forgotten soldier. He was the one they turned to for answers. He was the one who had been through the darkest times and had come out the other side with the wisdom to lead. As the convoy rolled into the base, the soldiers began to unpack and process the results of the mission. They had learned more than just combat tactics on this operation. They had learned what true leadership looked like. Arthur's influence on them was undeniable. But as the team disbanded, Arthur felt the weight of it all settle in. He hadn't wanted this much attention, this much responsibility. But now that it was here, he had no choice but to rise to the occasion. Later that day, Arthur found himself in Colonel Bradford's office once again. The colonel had a look of quiet approval on his face as Arthur entered. "You did well, Arthur," the colonel said, his voice steady but filled with respect. "The mission was a success, and I have you to thank for it. You stepped up when we needed you most." Arthur nodded, his expression neutral. "We did it as a team, Colonel. Every one of them played a part." "But you led them, Arthur," the colonel insisted. "That's what I'm talking about. You brought them together. You've done more than any of us could have done alone." Arthur didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to hearing these kinds of words, especially not about himself. He had always been more comfortable in the background, doing the work without expecting recognition. But now, it seemed, the world was changing around him. He couldn't deny that things were different. The soldiers now saw him as more than just a leader in battle. They saw him as a mentor, someone whose guidance could shape their futures. And in that moment, Arthur realized that he had become a bridge between the past and the future, a link between the soldier he had once been and the leader he had become. The colonel's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's more coming, Arthur. We've got other teams looking to you for guidance. I need you to keep doing what you're doing, leading, teaching, helping them see the bigger picture." Arthur met the colonel's gaze, his expression steady. "I'll do what I can, sir. I'm not the one who needs to be in the spotlight. They do. I just want to make sure they're ready." The colonel smiled. "And that's why you're the one leading them. You're not in it for the glory. You're in it for them. That's the difference, Arthur." Arthur nodded once more. "I just want to make sure they're prepared. That's all that matters to me." As the conversation ended and Arthur made his way out of the colonel's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had stepped into the light once more, but now it wasn't just about the missions or the recognition. It was about the people he was helping along the way. The soldiers, the younger men and women who had once looked up to him, now had something more than just a leader to follow. They had a mentor. They had someone who had seen the worst of the world and had come back with the strength to guide them through it. And that, Arthur realized, was worth more than any award or medal could ever be. The next few weeks were filled with new challenges, new teams to guide, and new missions to lead. But as Arthur watched the soldiers move forward, grow stronger, and face their own battles with newfound confidence. He knew that he had done what he set out to do. He had shaped the future, not through accolades or praise, but through quiet, steadfast leadership. For the first time in a long time, Arthur Hayes felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not in the shadows, not in the background, but at the forefront, leading those who would carry the torch forward, just as he had once done. And as he looked out at the base, watching the next generation of soldiers prepare for their own battles, he knew that the work he had done would last long after. He was gone. He had left his mark, not with words, but with actions. And that was all he needed. The days following the mission were a blur of new preparations and briefings, and yet Arthur Hayes felt more at ease than ever. The weight of being the leader, a mentor to the soldiers who had once seen him as nothing more than the quiet janitor, had begun to settle into his bones. He had always known that leadership wasn't about being in the spotlight or receiving accolades. It was about guiding others, helping them become more than they thought they could be. And as the soldiers continued to grow, so did the respect they had for him. The team that had followed Arthur into battle now followed him in life, learning from his every move. They listened carefully to his advice, even when he spoke in quiet tones, and they began to see the world through his eyes. They understood what it meant to truly serve, not for recognition, but for the greater good. One afternoon, as Arthur walked through the hangar, he noticed a familiar face standing by the hangar doors. It was Sergeant Nathaniel Carter, the young soldier who had once been skeptical of him. Nathaniel had changed over the past few weeks. He no longer viewed Arthur with the same doubt in his eyes. There was a newfound respect there, an understanding that had formed between them. Nathaniel looked up as Arthur approached, his posture straightening instinctively. "Arthur," he greeted, his voice no longer tentative. "Got a minute?" Arthur paused, raising an eyebrow. "What's on your mind, Sergeant?" Nathaniel hesitated for a moment, clearly gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I've been thinking about what you said on the mission," he began. "The way you handled everything. It made me realize something. I wasn't ready for the field, not really. But you helped me see that leadership isn't about being the loudest or the toughest. It's about keeping calm when things go south. It's about making sure your team knows you've got their backs." Arthur nodded, his expression softening. "Leadership isn't about being perfect, Nathaniel," he said quietly. "It's about knowing your weaknesses and still doing what needs to be done. Your team looks to you, not because you're perfect, but because they trust you." Nathaniel seemed to absorb the words with a sense of newfound clarity. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted. "But now I get it. You don't just tell us what to do. You show us how to do it, how to stay calm when everything else is falling apart." Arthur gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's the job," he said simply. "And you're learning it well. You're ready for whatever comes next." Nathaniel's expression brightened, a look of determination settling over his features. "Thanks, Arthur," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I won't let you down." As the days passed, Arthur continued to lead his team through a series of high-pressure missions. The bond between him and the soldiers grew stronger with each operation, and the respect they had for him was no longer just based on his past achievements. It was based on his ability to lead by example, his unwavering commitment to the team's success. But despite all the progress, Arthur still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he needed to do. He had helped them grow, but now it was time to ensure that they could stand on their own, that they could lead without him if the situation required it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the base, Arthur gathered the team together for a final debriefing. The soldiers sat in a semicircle around him, their eyes focused on their leader. "We've accomplished a lot together," Arthur began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet pride. "You've all proven that you're capable of handling anything that comes your way. But there's one thing I need to make clear." The room fell silent, and the soldiers leaned forward, eager to hear what Arthur had to say. Leadership isn't just about following orders. It's about making decisions in the heat of the moment. It's about knowing when to step up and when to step back. I've been leading you, but the time will come when you'll need to lead on your own. And when that time comes, you have to be ready. The words hung in the air, a weighty reminder of the responsibility they all carried. Arthur's gaze swept across the room, meeting each soldier's eyes. "I'm proud of each one of you," he said. "But it's time for you to take the reins. It's time for you to lead your own teams, make your own decisions. I've taught you what I can, but now you have to take everything you've learned and apply it." For a moment, no one spoke. The soldiers sat there, absorbing the gravity of his words. Then, slowly, one by one, they stood, their expressions resolute. Nathaniel was the first to speak, his voice clear and strong. "We're ready, Arthur," he said. "We've learned from the best. Now, we'll do our part." Arthur smiled, a rare, genuine smile that showed the pride he felt for the men and women in front of him. "I know you will," he said. "Now go. Lead the way." As the soldiers left the room, Arthur stood there for a moment, watching them go. They were ready. They were no longer just following him. They had become leaders in their own right. And as Arthur watched them walk out into the world, he knew that the future of the team was in good hands. His work was done. He had done what he set out to do, not just as a leader, but as a mentor. And now, it was time for him to step back. The next generation was ready to take over. And for Arthur, that was enough. Weeks passed since Arthur Hayes had gathered his team, and the change in them was undeniable. The soldiers were no longer the same men who had followed him into battle so many times before. They were more confident, more capable, and most importantly, they had learned what it truly meant to lead. They had seen Arthur in action, not just as a man of experience, but as a man who taught by doing. And now, they were ready to take on the world without him. But for Arthur, there was still a feeling of restlessness. He had spent so much of his life in the shadows, quietly supporting others, but now, he found himself unsure of where to go next. He had led his team, guided them through danger, and shown them what leadership meant, but the mission was complete. There were no more operations for him to lead. The quiet life he had once known seemed to call to him again. He walked through the base, his thoughts clouded with uncertainty. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and when he looked up, Colonel Bradford was standing there, a faint smile on his face. "Arthur," the colonel greeted, his voice warm but serious. "Got a minute?" Arthur nodded, motioning for the colonel to walk with him. "Sure, sir. What's on your mind?" "I've been watching the team," the colonel began, his gaze thoughtful. "You've done a hell of a job with them. They're ready, Arthur. They're ready to stand on their own, and that's because of you." Arthur glanced at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've just been doing my job, Colonel. Nothing more." The colonel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's more than that, you know. You've been more than just a leader. You've been a teacher, a mentor. And now, it's time for them to step into their own." Arthur didn't reply immediately. He had always known that the soldiers would have to learn to lead without him, but hearing it from the colonel made it feel more final. "I know they're ready," Arthur said, his voice low. "But what about me, Colonel? What's next for me?" The colonel gave him a hard look, his tone shifting. "You've spent your life leading, Arthur. But now it's time for you to decide what you want. You don't have to go back to the shadows. You can step forward. There's more out there for you, if you choose to take it." Arthur stopped walking for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. He hadn't thought about it like that. He had always been content to stay out of the limelight, to guide from the background. But maybe that was no longer enough. Maybe it was time to fully embrace what he had become, a leader, a mentor, and someone who still had much to offer. "You're right," Arthur said after a long pause, his voice steady. "I've spent my whole life doing what others need. Maybe it's time I do something for myself." Colonel Bradford smiled, a proud glint in his eyes. "That's the spirit, Arthur. Whatever you choose to do, I know you'll keep making an impact. You've earned that right." The conversation left Arthur with a lot to think about, but it also sparked something within him. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just looking to the next mission or the next task. He was thinking about his future, the path that lay ahead now that the soldiers he had led were capable of standing on their own. Later that evening, Arthur stood at the edge of the base, looking out over the horizon. The sky was streaked with orange and pink as the sun set behind the distant mountains. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only noise, and for the first time in years, Arthur allowed himself to reflect on everything he had accomplished. He had given so much of himself to the soldiers, teaching them, guiding them, but now it was time to think about the next chapter. He wasn't sure what that would look like yet, but he knew he wasn't done. The world still had more to offer him, and maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to step into a new role, one that wasn't defined by the shadows of the past, but by the legacy he had built. Arthur turned away from the horizon, his mind clear for the first time in years. Whatever came next, he was ready. The soldiers had learned what it meant to lead, and now it was his turn to learn what it meant to live for himself. The road ahead was uncertain, but Arthur Hayes had always been someone who faced uncertainty with strength and resolve. This was just the beginning of the next chapter in his journey. The weeks that followed were a quiet, but meaningful time for Arthur Hayes. The team he had led, the young soldiers who had once seen him as just a janitor, were now thriving in their newfound leadership roles. They had carried the lessons Arthur had taught them and had grown stronger because of it. They didn't need him to lead them anymore. He had done his job, and they were ready to face the world on their own. As for Arthur, he continued to fulfill his duties on the base, but his mind often wandered. The mission, the leadership, and the mentorship had rekindled something within him, a sense of purpose, a sense of direction that he had long since pushed aside. He was no longer content to merely be a background figure in the military world. He had always led in the shadows, but now he felt the pull of something more. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about glory. It was about finding his place in a world that had evolved and changed so much. Arthur had always been one to keep his emotions close to the chest, but for the first time in a long time, he felt as though there was more to life than just the work. As the days passed, he found himself standing on the edge of the base one evening, gazing out at the horizon, deep in thought. The sun had just dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across the land. It was a familiar sight, one that had always been a symbol of the passage of time, of change. The same landscape that had witnessed the soldiers come and go, the same land that had been the backdrop to so many missions, had now become a place of reflection for Arthur. It was there, in the quiet of the evening, that Arthur came to a decision. He was ready to take the next step, not for himself, but for the legacy he had built, for the men and women he had mentored, for the soldiers who had learned from him and who now stood on their own. It was time to pass the torch. It was time to step away from the world he had known for so long and let the next generation take charge. The thought wasn't as daunting as it had once been. It was liberating. The truth was, Arthur had always known this day would come. Leadership was never about holding on to power or control. It was about knowing when to step back and let others lead. He had done his part, and now it was time for him to move on, to find a new path, a new chapter. But before he could make that final decision, there was one last thing he needed to do. He needed to gather the soldiers one last time. They had all learned from him, but now it was time for him to learn from them. They had become leaders in their own right, and Arthur knew that it was time to hear their thoughts, their ideas, and their plans for the future. So, he called them together in the same room where he had once led them. This time, however, the roles were different. They were the ones leading. Arthur stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression calm but resolute. The soldiers, now confident in their abilities, stood before him, ready to take charge. "You've all come a long way," Arthur began, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion. "When I first met you, you were uncertain, unsure of yourselves. But now I see leaders. I see men and women who will carry the mission forward." He paused, his eyes meeting each of theirs, silently acknowledging the hard work they had put in. "I've taught you everything I know, but now it's your turn. The time has come for you to step into the world and make your own path. Lead with the same integrity, strength, and humility that you've seen in me. You're ready." The soldiers, standing before their leader, felt a deep sense of pride. They knew what Arthur had done for them. They knew that his leadership had shaped them into who they were today. And now, they understood that it was their turn to carry the weight of responsibility. The quiet janitor who had once walked among them, unnoticed, was now the man who had shaped their futures. One by one, the soldiers stepped forward, each of them speaking with a newfound confidence, a confidence that had been built through Arthur's guidance. They spoke of their hopes, their plans, and their commitment to the mission. They promised to lead with honor, to honor the lessons Arthur had taught them, and to never forget the quiet man who had led them when they needed it most. As the meeting came to a close, Arthur looked at each of them. He saw the same determination in their eyes that he had once had. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had led them, taught them, and now he could let go. They were ready. As he walked out of the room, Arthur felt the weight of his decision settle in. He was ready to move on. He had spent his life in service to others, and now it was time to live for himself. He wasn't sure what the future held, But for the first time in years, he was no longer afraid. The journey had been long, and the road ahead was uncertain, but Arthur Hayes was ready to face whatever came next.